We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Aleph and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 60a. On the previous summit, the Mishnah began and said that if a Balabai says he's going to sell from a particular field, let's say new grain, he can't give new grain from a different field. And the Mishnah continues, V'ein sarach lomar chadashim b'yeshanim. He certainly can't give new for old. Rashi explains, V'ein sarach lomar chadashim b'yeshanim. Pasak limchor lo yeshanim, meaning to say, let's say he arranged that he was going to give him the old grain. Lo yerev behen chadashim. He certainly can't mix in new grain. Shayeshanim yeveshin v'osin kemach yoser min chadashim. Rashi says that the older grain is dry and it's easier to make flour from it more than the new, so you can't put obviously an inferior quality. You can't even do the same quality if it's from a different field. And the Mishnah continues, Be'emes amru, in truth they said, B'yayin hitiru la'arev kasha barach. When it comes to wine, it's permitted to mix strong wine with weak wine, b'vnei shu mashbicho, because he improves it. Rashi explains, b'vnei shu mashbicho kasha mashbiach esarach. The stronger wine improves the weaker wine. Lafikach pasak imo rach. Therefore, let's say he said he was going to give him the weaker wine, ma'arev bo kasha. He is allowed to mix in the stronger wine. And Rashi continues, V'dafka katani kasha barach v'lo rach b'kasha. It's particularly in this direction that you're putting in the stronger wine and improving the weaker. Pasak imo kasha lo yerev b'asarach. But let's say the reverse. Let's say he says he's going to give him strong wine. He can't mix in weaker wine. And Rashi further notes, V'chein ein sarach lomar chadashim b'yeshanim dafka. Also, it doesn't need to be said that it's specifically new grain with older grain that is problematic. Aval yeshanim b'chadashim. But let's say older grain with the newer grain, shaper dummy, that would be okay. And the Gra over here points out, Aval Harif Cholek Alza. The Rif actually argues on Rashi and says that would not be okay. V'lechein Amar Hamasnisin Davka Al Yayin. That's why the Mishnah only says it by wine, but not by the grain. V'chein Perish Arush. And the Rush agrees with that explanation as well. And the Mishnah continues, Ein ma'arvin shimre yayin b'yayin. You can't mix in the sediments of the wine with the wine. Avol nosin lo es shemara, but he could give him the sediment, meaning he doesn't have to strain out the sediment, but he can't mix in sediment. And the Mishnah continues, Mishan es ariv mayim b'yeno. If somebody has water mixed with his wine, lo yimcharenu b'chanos. He shouldn't sell it in a store. Ela imken hodio, unless he makes it known that there's water mixed in. V'lo letagar, and he shouldn't sell it to a merchant. Afal pisha hodio, even though he lets him know. She'eno ela l'ramos, because a merchant is only going to use that to cheat with. And the Mishnah continues, Makam shenagu lahatil mayim b'yayin yatilu. If it's a place where the custom is to put water into the wine, then they can do that. And the Mishnah continues, Hatagar notal mehe granos. The merchant can take from 5 threshing floors, v'nosin l'soch megurachas, and put it into one warehouse. Mehe gitos, or he can take from 5 wine presses, v'nosin l'soch pitomechon, and put it into one cask. Uvilvad shalo yehe miskavin la'ariv, as long as he does not have intention to mix. And Rashi explains, Ein ma'arvin shimre yayin b'yayin. You can't mix sediment of the wine with the wine. B'gemar mefarish, the Gemara will explain this. Yimcharenu b'chanos pruta pruta. Again, you're allowed to, if the water was mixed with the wine, you could sell in the store little by little. Ela imkein hodia, but you just have to make sure that you let the person know. L'chol echad v'yachad mehen shemayim muravin bo. Everybody who's buying from that store, from that wine, needs to know that there's water mixed in. V'lo l'tagar yimcharenu b'yachad, but you can't sell it all to a merchant at once. V'yafal pisha modi, even if he lets him know, l'fishayin locho ela l'ramos u'lamachor b'chanos, because his point of buying it is to cheat. In order to sell in the store, people won't be aware that there's water. Makom shenagu lahatil mayim b'yayin yatilu. If the custom is to put the water in the wine, they can do that. Dekevan denoagu, since that's the custom, ein kantos, no one's going to make a mistake. Shekol hayenos b'cheskas kain. The presumption is all the wine is like that. Hatagar notal mechamesh kronos, a merchant can take from 5 threshing floors. Shakol yodin bo shelo gadlu b'sados. Everybody knows the merchant didn't grow it in his own field. Umivnei adam harbe lokeach. Everyone knows he buys from a lot of people. Uvecheskas kein lochin. They're buying on that presumption. Megura is an otzer sha'ogren botua. Megura is a warehouse where they store the grain. Goren hu shadoshin v'zorin bo asatvu, and the goren is the threshing floor where they thresh it. V'derech hatagar liknos mi bali batim b'shas hagoren lahachnas l'megura shalo. That's what the merchant does. He buys it from beres bali batim and he puts it into the warehouse. And finally, it said again, he can also buy from 5 wine presses and put it into one large cask, but he can't have kavona la'arev, which Rashi says means shelo yiskavin la'arev u'lahotzi kol liknos arov mimakom meshubach la'arev bo mimakom acher. That people should think it's all coming from a place where the quality is very high, but really he's mixing it. U'shchein of sevurin shekol haperos meyoso makom. The neighbors all think it's coming from this particular place, but it's really a mixture that he's not allowed to do. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ein tzarech lomar chadashas me'arba v'yeshanos mishalosh. We don't even need to say if the new grain is selling for 4 sa'ah per sela and the old grain is selling for 3 sa'ah per sela, so the old grain is more expensive. So certainly the ein ma'arvin, certainly you can't mix in the new grain, that's essentially cheaper. Ela afilu chadashas mishalosh, even if the new grain is selling for for 3 saw per sella, it's more expensive. V'yashanos me'arbin, the older grain is selling for 4 saw per sella. So there you might think already you can mix in the new grain. It's essentially higher quality if it's more expensive, but that's not true. Ein ma'arvin, you can't mix in the new grain. Mimnei she'adam rotza liyashnan, because the only reason it's selling for higher is because sometimes people want to age it themselves, but in reality the older grain is considered better quality, so you can't mix the new into the old. And Rashi explains, Tan Rabbanan in Tzarech Lomer Chadashos Me'arba Soin Besela V'Yashanos Mishalosh Soin Besela Dein Ma'arvin. Certainly you can't mix the new into the old in that case where the new is less expensive. Chadashos B'Yashanos, you can't move the new into the old. The whole of the Cheskas Yashanos Mochran, because if he's selling on the presumption that it's older, Nimsa Ma'aneu, so it comes out it's no. Mocher Lo Zulos B'Toras Yikaros, he's selling him cheaper stuff, but with the understanding that it's more expensive. Elafilu Chadashos Mishalosh V'Yashanos Me'arba, even if the new is 3 saw per sella and the old is 4 saw per sella, Ein Ma'arvin, so the new is more expensive, you still can't mix it in. Even though the new is more expensive, the idea is, the reason why it's more expensive, the new, it's not that it's the same quality as the old. It's just that sometimes people want to age it themselves. The person who wanted old did not want to age it himself. That's why it's prohibited to mix in the new grain, even if it is more expensive. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Be'emes amru, in truth they say, B'yayin hitiru la'arif kasha brach. When it comes to wine, it is permitted to mix the stronger wine with the weaker wine, Memneshu mashbicho, because he's just improving it. And the Gemara says, Amr Rebbe Lozer says, Ada Amra, this proves, Kol Be'emes amru halacha, that any time the Mishnah says Be'emes amru, that actually is the halacha. And Rashi explains, Ada Amra Zoso Maris, this proves, Kol Ada Kamo Hada, the word Ada is the same as Hada, again meaning this proves, Be'emes halacha, when anytime they say Be'emes, that's the halacha, meaning Midayav Tam Lamilsim Imnesha Mashbicha, from the fact that the Mishnah gives a reason, and says the idea is that he's improving it, Ve'ein Legam Game Bedavar, that means there's no doubt, V'nakat Bal Lamasnisin Be'emes, and then they use the word Be'emes, Shma Mina Kol Eicha Datani Be'emes halacha, you see, anytime it says Be'emes, that's the halacha, Ve'ein Lechasim or Legam Game Bedavar, there is no doubt about the matter. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman says, Uvein Hagitos Shanu, our Mishnah, when it says you can mix the stronger wine with the weaker wine because it improves it, that's specifically when it's among the wine presses, meaning to say when it's still in the process of fermenting, that's when it improves it, otherwise that's not the case. But the Gemara continues, Voidna, but what about nowadays? The Kamar Vishalobin Hagitos, they even mix it when it's not among the wine presses. The Gemara says to that, Amar Papa says, the Yadi v'kamachli, the buyers are aware, and they're mochel, they forgive it, and that's why it's allowed. And the Gemara continues with another answer. Avacha Breid Ravika, Ravacha, the son of Ravika, says, Hamoni Rabbi Achai, who is the one that says that you're allowed to do it even when it's Shalobin Hagitos. It's Rabbi Acha. The Tanya is we learned in a Bryce, so Rabbi Acha Matir, Bedavar Hanitam. Rabbi Acha says it's mutter if it's something that's going to be tasted by the buyer, and so the buyer is aware of exactly what he's buying, then it is going to be permitted. And Rashi explains, Uvein Hagitos Shano, again our Mishnah is talking about when it's among the wine presses, the Mashbicho Shatosis in Zem Zeh, V'nasim Tameh. Over there we say there's an improvement. They're essentially fermenting together and it becomes one taste. But after it's among the wine press, meaning each wine has its own unique smell and taste. It actually doesn't improve it, it actually makes it worse. The Yadi, and then the Gemara said, if everybody knows that they're mixing it together and they're mochel, then it's okay. And then the Gemara said, Bedavar Hanitam, that it could be okay if it's something that's tasted before it's bought. Sha'adam toim kodem shalacha, if somebody's tasting it before he buys it, he's aware of the fact there was a mixture, so in that situation it's going to be permitted. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Ve'ein ma'arvin shimra yayin b'yayin, you can't mix the sediment of the wine with the wine. Aval nosin lo eshamara, but you could have its sediment in there. And so the Gemara says, V'amrit reisha ein ma'arvin klal. Doesn't the reisha seem to imply you can't mix it all, and then you're saying it is allowed to have sediment? And the Gemara says, now if you're going to say, what does it mean he can put in the sediment to commodulate, that he simply informs him that there's sediment in there, but that can't be either. Hamidikatani Sefer, because what does it say at the end of the Mishnah? It says, Lo yimcher cherenu bechanus, he shouldn't sell it in the store. Ela imkein modio, unless he lets the buyer know. V'lo l'tager, he shouldn't sell it to the merchant. Afal pisha modio, even though he lets him know. Mechlal dereisha, so that implies that in the beginning of the Mishnah, when we're talking about sediment, afal gav de lo modale, even if he doesn't inform him, it seems to be permitted. And so again, it seems to be a contradiction here. It says ein ma'arvin, and then it says no sin lo shemarav. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Yehuda says, Hachi Kamer, this is what it means to say. Ein ma'arvin shemorim shel emesh b'shel yom. You can't mix in the sediments of yesterday from today into today's wine. V'lo shel yom b'shel emesh, you can't do of today into yesterday's wine. Avol nozen lo es shemara, but if it has its own sediment, the sediment meaning to say it's the wine from today and the sediment from today, that's going to be okay. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Namihach, we have a brisa like this as well. Rabbi Yehuda says, Hashofa yayin lechaver, if somebody is pouring wine for his friend, and the idea of shofar is you're pouring it, shofar is that you're pouring the wine and trying to keep the sediment, that the sediment should be left behind. Hareza lo yarev shel emesh b'shel yom, you can't mix in the sediment of yesterday into today. V'lo shel yom b'shel emesh, you can't mix in the sediment of today into yesterday's wine. Aval ma'arev shel emesh b'shel emesh, but you could mix in yesterday to yesterday, b'shel yom, and today into today. And Rashi explains, Shalemesh of yesterday, Miyayin Sheshafa Emesh, meaning the wine that he poured yesterday, V'nisharu Hashmar, when he left the sediment, Ein Ma'arvin Oso Biyayin Sheshafa Yom, you can't mix that sediment into the wine he's pouring today. Sheshimra Yayin Zem Mekalkal and Yayin Acher. The idea is that sediment from one wine can ruin another wine. Avol Nosinu Lo Shemar of Shel Yayin Atzmo, but if it's the sediment of this wine, that is fine. And Rashi continues, V'yom ve'emesh lav dafka. We're talking about today, yesterday. It doesn't really mean specifically today and yesterday. V'uadin liyom v'yom mishtei chavius. The same would be true if it's all from today but two different barrels. Ela orcha demilsa nakat. It's just saying this is generally how it's done. To stam yom ve'emesh mishtei chavius. In general, when you have today's and yesterday's, it's usually from two different barrels. And Rashi continues, Hashofa yayin kol davar hatzol hanizrik benachas mikli al kli. If you're pouring something in a slow fashion from one vessel to the other, shelo yisarvu bo shmorim, in order that you don't mix in sediment, kari lo shafiyah. That's referred to as shafiyah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Misha nesariv ma'im b'yeno, if somebody's wine is mixed with water, hareza lo yimcherenu b'chanos, he shouldn't sell it in the store, el imkein modio, unless he informs the customers that they are buying diluted wine. And the Gemara says, Rava aisu lechamre mechanusa. Rava, they brought him wine from the store. Mazge, he poured water into it. He diluted the wine. Tuame, and then he tasted it, and lo have basim. It wasn't tasty. So shadre lechanusa, so he sent it back to the store. Amar le Abaye said to him, Abaye said to Rava, v'hanon tanan, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah? V'lo letager, you can't give diluted wine to the merchant, afal pisha odio, even though he lets him know, because we're afraid that he's going to mislead the consumers. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le, he said back to him, Mozgad yidi, when I dilute the wine, made the idea, it's known that it's diluted. V'chi tema de tafiyu mechaylin, if you're going to say that the merchant is going to add wine and he'll sweeten it, umezavin le, and sell it that way, but if that's a concern, ein l'davar sof, then there's no end to the concerns that we can have. And Rashi explains, Mazge nosan bo mayim shekein darko, he added water, that's what Rava would do. Basim mevusim v'tov means to say tasty, it wasn't tasty, so he sent it back. And the Gemara then asks, V'anon tanan, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah, V'lo l'tagar she'enu ela l'ramos, he can't give it to a merchant, because he's going to use it to cheat people. And Rashi explains, V'chen vani hainu tagar, a storekeeper is the same as a merchant. V'yachzor chen vani zeviyim kerenu, b'chezkas yain b'chanos. Now the storekeeper is going to go and sell it with the presumption that it's regular wine, V'arei amayim u'ravin bo, but really it's diluted with water. V'yatam macharta lo, v'yiko lifnei iver, now you sold it to him, that's lifnei iver. And so he answered, Mezika didi made the idea, everybody knows when I dilute the wine, shani nosin bo mayim harbe, I put a lot of water there, there's nothing to be misled about. Now if you're going to say that he's going to bring wine, he's going to bring more wine in order to sweeten it, and people won't realize there's water, and if that's the case, that we're so concerned, there'd be no end. At that point, you might as well prohibit from selling even water to a storekeeper. Maybe he'll mix the water into wine. The only real concern is, let's say I sell something to him that with the product as is, he can cheat with, that's already a problem. But if he has to tamper with the product in order to cheat, that is not a concern of ours. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Makam shenag v'lahatal mayim b'yayin yatilu v'chulu." If it's a place where the custom is to dilute the wine, then that is fine. And the Gemara says, "Tana was taught lemechsa l'shlish v'lerevia." They diluted either half or a third or a quarter, whatever the custom is in that place. That is fine. And the Gemara continues. Amar Rav. Rav says, "Uvein hagitos shana." We're talking when the wine is still among the wine press. It's at that point of time that diluting it's still going to be good. But if you dilute it at a later stage, the wine will not be good. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Lo yecholek hachenvoni kloyos ve'gozen letinokos." A storekeeper should not distribute toasted grain or nuts to the children, mibnei shumar gilon lavo etzlo, because that causes them to come regularly to the store. V'chachamim matir, and the chachamim say that is mutter. V'lo yifchos es ashar. A person shouldn't lower his prices below the market price in order to get the customers to come to him. V'chachamim Omer, but the chachamim say zocher latov. If somebody does that, he should be remembered for good. He's causing competitive pricing. He's causing the prices to go down. And the Mishnah continues, Lo yavar es agris, and a person shouldn't sift the beans, divrei abashol, that's the opinion of abashol. The chachamim matir, and the chachamim say it's mutter. Umodim shelo yavar me'al pi magur, but everybody admits that you can't sift those that are at the top of the bin to make it look like it's all been sifted when it really has not. She'eno ela kagone v'so'ayin, because that is just deception. And the Mishnah continues, Ein mefarchasin lo es ha'adam v'lo es ha'behema v'lo es ha'kelim. You can't adorn people or animals or vessels that you're selling. Let's say the people are being sold as slaves, or the animals are being sold, the vessels are being sold. You can't adorn them because, again, that's like deception, making them look better than they are. You have to keep them, you have to sell them as is. And Rashi explains, "V'lo yifchos es ashar." You can't sell below the market price. Limchor bezol, to sell very cheap. Mimnei shemargil lavo etzlo, because he causes people to come to his store. Umekapeach mezonos chaveru, he's taking away the business of his friend. Zocher lato, but the other opinion is that's fine. He's remembered for good. Shemitoch kach utzrei peros mochim bezol. Because of that, people will start selling cheaper. Grisen, and then when it comes to the beans, polin gurusos berechayim achas l'shtayim. It's when they grind up the beans with the millstone. Lo yavar es apsolas. He can't sift out the junk. Because the fact that they look better, he ends up charging much more money from the price of whatever he took out that was psolas, whatever he took out that was bad, that which he took out that didn't really cause it to go up so much in value, but he charges so much more. That's why it's a problem. The chachamim matir, and the chacham say it's mutter time and mefarish b'gemara. The reason will be explained in the Gemara. Now everybody agrees that he can't just sift from that which is at the top of the bin. He hasn't really taken out the psolas on the inside. He only took out the psolas that was at the top. That's a problem. Because when he does that kind of breira, when he does that kind of sifting, that is deception. The Gemara will explain what exactly mefarchasin is. When we talk about a person, we're talking here about an Eved Kanani who is going to be sold. And the Gemara says, "My time mayu derabbanan." What's the reason of the rabbanan that they allow the storekeeper to distribute nuts? The Amar Le, because he can say to him, meaning he can say to his competitor, "Anam mifalignam guze," I'll distribute nuts. Viat polig shiski, and you can distribute. Rashi says shiski is prunes. It seems to be prunes. Others say that shiski is jujubes, which is a kind of date. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'lo yifchos es ashar." He shouldn't again sell below the market price. V'chachamim omrim zocher latov. The chachamim say that he should be remembered for good. The Gemara says, "My time of the rabbanon." What's the reason of the rabbanon? And Rashi says, "My time anakat zocher latov." Why is it that it says this language of zocher latov, lashon bracha, language of a blessing? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Amid Beis.